Settle in and let your breathing slow, as if the whole room is turning down its volume. Outside your imagined window, the sea is working patiently, lifting and lowering the dark like a heavy blanket. You are arriving by boat at a lonely rock where damp wood and salt air cling to everything you touch. A lighthouse looks like a simple tower, but it is really a small machine for making certainty. Tonight, you will learn its quiet routines, the lens that gathers lamplight into a clean beam, and the way fog turns signals soft. You will listen to a horn that vibrates the air, and to early radio polite crackle, dots and dashes, and long stretches of calm. Here with the Sleepless Scientist, you are not chasing adventure, you are practicing steady attention, one slow rotation at a time. The boat does not glide in like a movie scene. It bumps and scrapes and argues with the dock as if the dock started it. Your boots meet wood that has been soaked, dried, and soaked again until it has the stubborn texture of old rope. The air tastes like salt and cold iron. You think the lighthouse will feel like a monument? Wrong. Up close, it feels like equipment. It is rivets, hinges, paint layers, and a door that swells in wet weather. The beam sweeps past you again, bright for a moment, then gone, like a slow blink from something too large to care. You carry a lantern, or maybe you carry the memory of one. Its light is small and warm, and it cannot compete with the ocean. The sea does not shine for you. It just reflects whatever is available: moonlight, starlight, the pale smear of cloud, and when the beam returns, it lays a straight white path across moving water, then erases it without apology. You step into the entry room, and the world narrows. The walls are thick, and they hold the day's chill. Everything smells faintly of oil, damp cloth, and that particular clean sting of salt on metal. Your first job is not heroic. Your first job is to make sure the building stays a building. You check the door, and you feel the latch seat properly. You check the windows because salt likes to creep into seams and do slow damage. You listen for the wind, not because it is poetic, but because it tells you what the night will cost. A steady wind means steady work. A gusty wind means things will rattle, and you will need to find what is loose. In a place like this, sound is data. The waves are the baseline, constant, heavy, and patient. The tower adds its own small noises, a pipe ticking as it cools, a nail shifting in timber. Somewhere above, the lantern room has a faint mechanical whisper, rotation, bearings, a mechanism that would like you to keep it oiled. And underneath it all, there is the thin hiss of a lamp or the gentle mutter of a generator, depending on the era and the station. If you are expecting silence, you will be disappointed. Silence is mostly a luxury of well-insulated rooms and polite city nights. Here, the ocean keeps talking. Even when it is calm, it clears its throat against the rock. You climb the stairs, and the stairwell smells different with every turn. Lower down, it is wet stone and stored rope. Higher up, it becomes warmer, sharper, more chemical, kerosene, brass polish, paint. Your hand slides along a rail worn smooth by years of other hands. Not famous hands, just hands that showed up night after night to do the same checks and keep ships from becoming rumors. This is the first science lesson, and it is not glamorous. A lighthouse works because routines work. The physics is beautiful, yes, but the physics also depends on a person noticing a cracked pane before the storm finds it. A lighthouse is a machine, and you are one of its parts tonight. At the top, the lantern room is cooler than you expect. Glass loses heat quickly, and wind steals it faster. You can feel the draft in the seams, tiny cold fingers testing the joints. The glass around you is not just glass. It is a barrier between a controlled fire and an ocean full of flammable human plans. You do your checks the way keepers learn to do them, in the same order every time. Because if you trust your memory, you will eventually forget something important. You look for soot. You look for salt film. You look for moisture where it should not be, and for dryness where it should not be. You listen for a change in the rotating mechanism's voice, a scrape where there was once a purr, and you glance at the light itself, not to admire it, but to judge it. Is the flame steady? Is the wick trimmed? Is the mantle intact if you are working with that kind of lamp? Is the fuel line clean? Does the whole arrangement look like it will last until morning without deciding to invent a new problem? Outside, the beam sweeps again. Up close, it is almost rude. It lights up the sea, the rocks, the mist in the air, then moves on like it has an appointment. From far away, sailors see it as comfort. From here, you see it as repetition. You begin to understand the strange comfort of repetition too. The same stairs, the same latch, the same logbook, the same horizon that never holds still, even when nothing happens. You turn to the log and you write down what matters: wind direction, cloud cover, lamp condition, anything that felt off. You are not writing a memoir. You are leaving instructions for the future, and the future might be you, half asleep in 6 hours. The ocean has an anachronistic way of forcing good behavior. It does not care about your confidence. It only cares about your preparation. So, you make your rounds. You touch what needs touching. You tighten what needs tightening. And you accept that the building has its own mood. And once you have learned the building's nighttime noises, your attention drifts upward toward the light itself, doing its patient work. You think the light is a constant spear, stabbing into darkness without pause. Wrong again. The beam is a rhythm. It is a rotating promise. It appears, brightens, peaks, then slides away into nothing, and comes back on schedule. Out at sea, that schedule is everything. A sailor does not need a lighthouse to be beautiful. They need it to be predictable. The rotation makes a pattern, and the pattern becomes a kind of name. You stand close enough to hear the mechanism that makes that rhythm. In many lighthouses of the age, it is clockwork logic made physical. Weights hang down a central shaft, heavy and patient, like a pendulum that forgot to swing. Gravity pulls the weights. The weights drive gears. The gears turn the lens assembly. And the lens assembly turns messy flame into a disciplined message. You can almost hear the math without doing it. Torque, friction, inertia, all of it hiding inside a sound that is mostly just a soft, mechanical breathing, a slow click, a smooth roll, a muted whir, the kind of sound that tells you things are working. If the light is electric, the principle does not change. You still need rotation, or shutters, or timed flashes. You still need a signature. You just trade falling weights for motors, and you trade wick trimming for filament checks. Either way, you learn that the romantic part is optional. The dependable part is not. The real star of the lantern room is the lens, not the lamp, not the tower, the lens. It is called a Fresnel lens, spelled like a name because it is a name. Augustin Jean Fresnel, a person who solved an ocean-sized problem with a stack of careful shapes. Before this lens became common, Lighthouse optics were bulky and inefficient. Big, thick glass, heavy as gilt, trying to bend light into usefulness. Fresnel's trick was to take a fat lens and carve it into rings, like a tree, sliced into thin circular steps. Same bending power, much less mass. You look at it, and it looks like jewelry designed by someone who hated dust. Concentric circles, edges that catch your lantern light and scatter it into tiny rainbows. It is beautiful in the way machinery can be beautiful when it is doing exactly what it was built to do. Here is what the lens is doing in plain human language. The lamp sends light in almost every direction because that is what light does when it is born from a flame. Wild, messy, eager to waste itself, the lens takes that chaos and gives it a job. It bends rays that would have gone into the floor or the ceiling or your tired face, and it persuades them outward, not upward, not downward, outward, across the sea, where a human eye might be waiting. This is not magic. It is refraction, the simple fact that light changes speed when it moves from air into glass. When it changes speed, it changes direction. So the lens is really a set of curved negotiations, telling the light, no, not that way, this way. You can imagine the light as a crowd leaving a stadium after a game. Without fences, everyone spills everywhere, bumping into each other, getting lost in parking lots, wandering into the wrong life. With good fences, the crowd becomes a stream, and the stream becomes a road. The lighthouse lens is those fences. It takes a modest lamp and makes it feel powerful because it is no longer wasting itself in all directions. A sailor miles away does not need a sun. They need a clean, intentional line. You walk around the lens assembly, slowly, careful not to touch the glass with bare fingers. Oil from skin becomes a smudge. A smudge becomes a weak spot in the beam. A weak spot becomes a misunderstanding on the horizon. And misunderstandings out there have consequences that make paperwork look adorable. The pattern matters too. Some lighthouses flash once every few seconds. Some flash in pairs. Some have a long glow, then a short one, then dark. Each is a signature, a little optical accent. To you, it might feel like over-engineering. Why not just keep the light on? But there are many lights in the world, and the coast is full of distractions. A town's lights, a ship's lights, a star low on the horizon doing its best impression of civilization. So the lighthouse says its name by blinking. It turns identity into time. It is the same principle as a ringtone in the age of early phones, when you could hear someone else's device and know with mild annoyance that it was not yours. Out here, that same idea is reassurance instead of irritation. You glance down at the lamp again and you consider the fuel. In many stations, kerosene is the workhorse, stable enough energy-rich enough, and willing to burn with a bright, steady flame. Earlier systems used whale oil, which is exactly as charming as it sounds. A whole animal processed into light because humans have always been willing to do bizarre things to avoid the dark. Kerosene has its own personality. It wants clean storage. It wants a wick that is not charred. It wants airflow so it can burn efficiently, not smoking up your beautiful lens with soot, because soot is the enemy of optics. Soot turns crisp geometry into a dull smear. So you clean, you wipe, you check drafts, you adjust small screws that control wick height, the kind of delicate controls that make you feel like you are tuning an instrument, and in a way, you are. A flame has a sound. If you listen for it, a good flame is quiet, steady. A struggling flame hisses and flutters. You learn to hear the difference because hearing is often faster than seeing. Outside, the beam swings again, and you watch it paint the inside of the glass room for a moment. It makes everything bright and then normal. Bright and then normal. Now you notice something else. The light is not just going out. Some of it is coming back. In some lighthouse designs, mirrors sit behind the lamp to catch backward-going light and throw it forward again. Mirrors are the thrift stores of photons. They take what would have been wasted and give it another chance. A mirror does not bend light the way a lens does. It reflects. Angle in, angle out. Simple geometry. A quiet rule that never gets tired. This is the calm behind the whole enterprise. Light follows rules, so you can build a system that leans on those rules night after night. The ocean is chaos. The sky is mood. But light, at least in glass and air, is reliable until fog arrives. Fog is not darkness. Fog is a crowd of tiny water droplets hanging in the air like indecision. Each droplet is a little lens of its own. Each one grabs a piece of your beam and scatters it, so the beam does not turn off. It just loses its edge. Instead of a crisp line, you get a glow, a soft bloom, a halo that feels close even when it is not. If you have ever driven a car in thick fog, you know the insult. Your headlights are on, you can see the light, but the light is mostly showing you the fog itself, not the road. That is scattering. Light meeting particles similar in size to its wavelength and being sent on little detours. Some of it goes back to you, some goes sideways, some goes forward, but weakened and spread. A lighthouse in fog becomes less a pointer and more a presence. Sailors might still see it, but it does not tell them distance as cleanly. It becomes ambiguous. And ambiguity is what lighthouses were built to remove. So you keep the light perfect anyway. You keep the glass clean anyway. You keep the mechanism turning because fog comes and goes and the night is long. But there is a moment on some nights when you accept that light will not be enough. You can have the best optics on Earth and the atmosphere will still shrug. And when the air gets thick enough to swallow a beam, you reach for something that doesn't need visibility at all. Sound. You descend a little or you cross a narrow corridor toward the equipment that feels less elegant than a Fresnel lens. The fog signal does not care about beauty. It cares about brute force. A foghorn is a simple idea with a dramatic personality. You push air through a system that vibrates. That vibration becomes a pressure wave. The wave travels through air and over water and into the body of anyone listening. Unlike light, sound needs a medium. It cannot travel through empty space, which means out here, sound is intimate. It uses the same air you breathe. It borrows the same atmosphere that keeps you alive and uses it to carry warnings. There are different kinds of fog signals in the age you are visiting. Some are steam-powered, some are compressed air, some use a reed like a giant instrument. They all share one trait. They are not subtle. You open a valve or you engage a mechanism, and the horn answers with a long, low note that seems to come from the rock itself. It vibrates your ribs. It makes the lantern glass tremble faintly. It rolls out over the water like a slow animal. Low-frequency sound travels farther than high-frequency sound. In the messy real world of wind and waves, higher notes get absorbed and scattered more easily. Lower notes are stubborn. They bend around obstacles a little better. They keep their energy longer. Humidity helps sound in a way that feels unfair, because water vapor makes the air a little more willing to carry vibration. You expect wet air to swallow noise, but often, especially for lower tones, damp air lets sound slide farther than dry air. Temperature matters too, because air is not one uniform thing. On some nights, the air near the water is colder than the air above it. That layering is called a temperature inversion, and it bends sound like a lazy lens. Sound waves travel at slightly different speeds in warm and cold air. So, the wavefront curves, and when it curves the right way, your horn can travel strangely far or strangely short. You learn this the way you learn most coastal truths, not from a textbook, from a ship's captain later telling you over a tired handshake that the horn sounded close when it was not, or that it sounded far when it was right there, sliding out of the fog like a guilty thought. The fog signal has its own schedule, just like the beam. One long blast every minute maybe, or two shorter ones with a pause, depending on the station and the chart. You are not just making noise, you are speaking a timed language into wet air. And because humans love to turn everything into paperwork, those patterns are published. A mariner reads them in a light list and memorizes them the way you memorize a friend's footsteps. In fog, distance becomes an argument, so sailors use timing like a ruler. They hear your blast, they start counting, not with drama, just with habit. Then they hear an echo off a cliff, or off another ship, or off the low belly of the clouds. The delay tells them something about the world's geometry. Not perfectly, but enough to keep them off rocks. You try it too, because you are standing on the rock itself, and you can. You listen for the horn's voice leaving, then returning as a thinner copy. Sometimes the echo is crisp, like someone tapping a glass. Sometimes it is smeared, like the sound got tired on the way back. Wind can steal an echo, and waves can hide it under their own steady violence. But on a calm fog night, you can hear the coastline talking to itself, and you begin to appreciate the ridiculous intimacy of sound. Light just passes by you. Sound goes through you. Every blast is a traveling squeeze, a brief compression and release, moving across your skin and into your bones. Congratulations, you are being gently kneaded by physics. In older systems, the horn is powered by steam, which is both practical and mildly unhinged. You burn fuel to boil water. The steam drives a mechanism that shoves air through a siren or a reed. It is a whole extra machine whose only job is to shout into bad weather. Later systems prefer compressed air because steam on a salty rock is a maintenance hobby that never ends. With compressed air, you run a pump, you fill a tank, you release the pressure through a rotating slotted disc, a siren that chops airflow into pulses. Those pulses become your note, and the note becomes a warning. You get used to the physical chores that keep that warning possible. Draining condensation from the airlines because water collects inside like a slow sabotage. Checking seals because salt loves to sit on rubber and turn it into crumbs. Listening for leaks, a faint constant hiss, the sound of your safety margin evaporating. The horn does not care if you are tired. It does not care if you are lonely. It has one demand: pressure, and you provide it because you have seen what fog does to confident people. It turns a modern ship into a blind animal. Out there, a captain can have charts and a compass and the best intentions, but if they cannot see, they start navigating by the shape of fear. So you keep the horn ready. You test it briefly because a full blast at close range is like being scolded by the atmosphere. The sound is so low, it feels almost slow, not sluggish, just heavy. The wavelength is long, like a lazy rope laid out in the air. That length is part of why it travels, because it is less bothered by small turbulence. Tiny eddies in wind are little obstacles. Short wavelengths trip, long wavelengths step over them. And still, the ocean can make fools of both light and sound. A hard wind can carry your blast away from the shipping lane, like tossing a paper plane sideways. A roaring surf can mask it completely, the background so loud the signal becomes decoration. So you do not trust your own ears alone. You trust the schedule. You trust the logbook. You write down when the fog signal ran and for how long, and whether it sounded right, because someday someone will ask. After a near miss, after a wreck, after a complaint. And your neat handwriting will be the difference between truth and a story. There is also the small psychological effect, the one no manual admits. The horn is not only for ships. It is for you. It proves you are awake. It proves the station is alive. Each blast is a slow heartbeat in the fog, telling you that time still exists. And when the fog is thick enough, you cannot even see your own railings clearly. So time is what you hold on to. You might imagine, in those moments, that the lighthouse is the center of the world. Wrong again. It is only a point, one coordinate, in a wet, indifferent grid. But you are here, and you can push a lever, and air will move. That is the kind of power humans can actually afford. Eventually, the horn pauses, because it has to. The tank needs filling, or the steam needs building, or the mechanism needs a rest. And between blasts, you hear what fog really sounds like. It is not silence. It is the dampening of sharpness, waves without sparkle, wind without edges. Your own footsteps sounding closer than they should. And then, somewhere in it, another signal. not yours. A distant horn, answering or passing or warning back. A call and response across invisible water. That is when you understand, in your tired bones, that the sea is not empty at night. It is just hard to witness. But then the weather loosens, as it always does. The fog thins or lifts or tears into streaks, and the beam becomes useful again. And you do what keepers always do. You switch off the drama and return to the clockwork of care. Because another kind of signal is waiting for you now. One that does not rely on visibility and does not rely on air. It relies on wires, batteries, and a polite crackle that pretends to be calm. You walk down into a smaller room, often tucked away from the salt wind, not as high as the lantern, not as open. A room that smells more like varnish and worn dust than like ocean. This is where early radio lives, like a nervous animal in a box. The equipment is not sleek. It is wood cabinets, brass fittings, ceramic insulators, and coils of wire wound with patient hands. A table with a key, a set of headphones, and a receiver that looks like it belongs in a magician's act. And it sort of does. Because the first time you hear a message arrive out of nowhere, you will feel a superstition forming. You sit down, the chair is plain and slightly uncomfortable, because comfort was never the point. You put on the headphones, and the world narrows again. Not to a tower this time, to a thin band of sound, full of static, a constant shushing, like dry sand poured slowly. The sea is still there, but it becomes background. The main thing now is the receiver's restless noise. Early radio is not friendly. It does not greet you with clear voices and stable tuning. It gives you fragments. It gives you hints. It gives you a lot of nothing. And then suddenly, meaning, you adjust a knob. Slowly, the static changes texture. It is the same sound, but rearranged, like turning a kaleidoscope of noise. What you are really doing is tuning a circuit, choosing which electromagnetic waves you want to pay attention to. The antenna outside is catching all kinds of energy, distant transmitters, nearby sparks, lightning hundreds of miles away, and the ordinary electrical fuss of machinery. The receiver cannot stop the world from arriving. It can only choose what part of the world becomes audible. That choice happens through resonance. A tuned circuit is like a swing. Push at the right rhythm, and the swing goes higher. Push at the wrong rhythm, and nothing much happens. So your coils and capacitors, your simple components with serious names, prefer one frequency over others. They respond strongly to one band and weakly to the rest. And then a detector turns that high-frequency wobble into something your ears can handle. In this era, much of what you receive is Morse code, dots and dashes, short and long pulses, making letters the way footsteps make a recognizable person in a hallway. You learn to hear it as language. At first, it is just tapping. Then it becomes words. Then it becomes personality. Some operators send crisp, clean code. Some are sloppy, rushing, leaning on dashes like they are tired. Some have a signature pause, a little hesitation that gives them away. A human fingerprint made out of timing. You also learn the strange intimacy of hearing another station's room tone, a faint hum, a slight drift. Sometimes you can tell when someone's generator is misbehaving, because the note under their signal wobbles. Radio is not only information, it is a window into someone else's maintenance habits. You press the headphones tighter, you rest your fingers on the key. The key is simple. A lever, a spring, 2 contacts. When you press it, you close a circuit. That allows current to flow. In a transmitter, that current helps create an oscillating signal which feeds the antenna. The antenna pushes and pulls on the electromagnetic field around it, like a hand stirring invisible water. And that stirring leaves. It travels, not as sound, not as air pressure, but as a ripple in electric and magnetic fields coupled together, moving at the speed light prefers. It is not supernatural. It is just Maxwell's equations doing their job in the dark. But you do not need the equations tonight. You need the practical truth. When you tap the key, someone far away can hear you if they are listening. And if the atmosphere cooperates, the atmosphere again. Because even radio has weather. The ionosphere, high above, is a layer of charged particles created by sunlight. During the day, it is energized and restless. At night, it changes, and those changes can make radio signals bend back toward Earth, allowing communication beyond the horizon. Or it can swallow them, or scatter them, depending on frequency and conditions. You learn that there is a sky above the sky, a whole invisible structure that decides whether you get company. Some nights, stations far away come booming in, loud and clear, as if the ocean shrank. Other nights, a nearby transmitter is faint, smothered in hiss. You do not take it personally. Radio does not care about your feelings either. There is also the coastal problem, corrosion. Salt air is an enthusiastic chemist. It finds metal and it starts trading electrons like it is bored. Contacts tarnish, wires green with oxide, screws freeze in place. So part of your job becomes small electrical hygiene. You clean terminals, you tighten connections, you keep moisture away from coils and capacitors, because water changes how electricity behaves. A wet insulator stops being an insulator. It becomes a slow leak, and slow leaks become strange problems. At 2 a.m, you keep spare parts, but not too many, because storage is limited. Fuses, dry cells, or wet lead-acid batteries depending on the setup. Extra bulbs for indicator lamps. A spare headphone set, because the sea loves to break the things you need most. If your station has its own generator, you learn its voice too. The steady chug, the vibration through floorboards, the warmth of its exhaust pipe. A generator is not magic. It is mechanical work turned into electrical current. Rotating coils, magnetic fields, induction. A practical conversion of fuel into electrons you can spend, and you spend them carefully. On the lamp, on the radio, on whatever small comforts this era allows. Because every system here depends on some stored energy. Oil, kerosene, coal, gasoline, or the chemical patience inside a battery. Now, you listen. There is a call sign, a little pattern of letters, an introduction in code. It is not for romance. It is so you know who is speaking, and so the record can later prove it. A ship might send its own identity and a position and a brief note. Visibility poor, speed reduced, hearing fog signal, requesting weather. You copy it down. pencil on paper. Because paper does not crash. Because paper does not need charging. Because paper, unlike memory, does not get fuzzy at 3 in the morning. You respond with what you know. Wind direction, barometer trend, if you have one, sea state, any warnings about shoals or drifting debris or ice if you are in that kind of latitude. The exchange is short, polite, and almost boring, which is exactly what everyone wants. If the radio gets exciting, something has already gone wrong. There is another sound in the headphones sometimes, a faint crackle that rises and falls, atmospheric noise, distant lightning, even beyond the horizon, making radio static like a nervous system twitching. You might not see a storm, but you can hear it in the receiver. Long before it arrives, radio becomes a kind of weather sense, an extra organ, not perfect, but useful. And on some nights, you catch the edge of human life, a coastal station chatting with another, a brief joke in code, a tired check-in, a confirmation that someone else is awake in another lonely building, listening to their own static. The loneliness does not vanish, but it becomes shared. Then the signal fades, because the ship turns, because the ionosphere shifts, because your antenna sways in the wind and changes its orientation by a small, annoying amount. You adjust the tuning again, careful, slow, and for a moment, you find nothing but hiss. That hiss can feel calming. It is a reminder that silence is not the absence of activity. It is just activity you are not translating. The room around you remains still. The tower continues its work above. The ocean continues its work outside. And you, in this small radio room, become a translator between worlds, between light and darkness, between sea and shore, between the ship's intention and the coast's indifference. You take off the headphones for a moment, and the ordinary sounds rush back in. The distant surf, the faint mechanical turning above you, the occasional ping of cooling metal. You realize how much of your attention the radio consumes, even when it says nothing. Because listening is work, not heavy work, but steady, like holding a cupful without spilling. You log the messages, time received, time sent, content, brief. And then, because you are a lighthouse keeper and not a novelist, you put the pencil down, you stand, you stretch your shoulders a little, you glance at the small equipment again, and you feel that quiet respect reserved for tools that mostly behave. This is early radio, the awkward teenage phase of a technology that will later become invisible and constant. Tonight, it is still physical. It is coils and sparks and careful tuning. It is patience made audible, and it changes your relationship with the sea. Because now you can receive a ship without seeing it. You can witness movement as information, a faint rhythm, dots and dashes, like raindrops you cannot see landing on a roof. And once you can sense ships like that, you start thinking about what makes them move at all. Not their engines, not yet. The larger forces, the push of wind, the drag of water, the slow conveyor belts of current, the physics that moves whole tons of steel as if it is nothing. You step back toward a window or a sheltered doorway. You look out, and the horizon is a dark seam. If there is moonlight, it lays a weak glaze over the waves. If there is none, the water becomes pure texture, seen only when it breaks. and you begin your weather watching the way others check a clock, not for entertainment, for warning, for routine, for the quiet comfort of naming what is coming. The air has a feel on your face, and it is rarely neutral. Sometimes it is soft, almost oily, warm enough to make the skin forget it is near the ocean. Sometimes it is sharp, cold, and drying, like the night wants to sandpaper your thoughts. You notice the smell first. A clean salt smell can mean steady conditions. A heavier, sourer odor, rich with seaweed and exposed shore, can mean a change in tide or wind direction. When the wind shifts, the lighthouse changes its own sound. The tower becomes a different instrument, a new whistle in a gap, a different rattle on a loose fitting. You can tell the wind is rising before you see it, because the building starts to complain. Clouds announce themselves too, but not with drama. The sky does not usually slam a door. It clears its throat. High, thin clouds, like brushed chalk, often arrive ahead of a front. They do not block much light, but they soften the stars. Then thicker layers follow, low and gray, and the horizon tightens. Pressure changes are invisible, but your instruments make them visible in ink and needle. If you have a barometer, it sits on the wall like a quiet judge. A falling needle is the ocean's way of sending you a memo. It means air is rising somewhere, and rising air tends to make weather. Storms are not objects. They are imbalances, trying to even out. Warm air meeting cold. Moisture condensing, latent heat released, fueling more lift. A feedback loop that the planet runs because it is always moving energy from where it is too much to where it is less. You do not have to fear that loop, but you do have to respect it because it can throw water at your rock hard enough to shake plates in cupboards. The sea surface tells you stories too. A local wind makes short, choppy waves. They are steep, close together, irritated. A distant storm makes swell. Longer waves, smoother, rolling in with a rhythm that feels older than the weather above you. That is one of the strangest things you learn. The ocean can deliver yesterday's violence to today's calm shore. A storm 100 miles away from hours ago sends you its aftermath as gentle rolling hills of water. So you cannot judge the world by your immediate surroundings alone. You have to think in distances, in delays, in how long energy takes to arrive. The keeper's log becomes your second brain. You write down wind speed as best you can, sometimes with an anemometer, sometimes with experience. You write down direction, using the compass points like old friends. Northwest, steady. Southwest, gusting. Calm, then shifting east. You note cloud type because naming things makes them manageable. Stratus, flat layers, like the sky gave up. Cumulus, heaps, like the atmosphere is practicing sculpture. Nimbus, the ones that actually mean business. You are not doing this to be scientific for fun. You are doing it because ships will ask, and because your home station depends on preparation. If a storm is coming, you check the lantern room extra carefully. You make sure vents are clear. You make sure doors latch properly. You make sure nothing can become a projectile in high wind. And in the age of early radio, you may send a simple weather note outward because a few words can spare someone a very long night. The sky gives you other hints too, the kind that do not need instruments or charts. The stars soften first, not vanishing, just losing their sharp edges in a thin veil. Then the moon, if it is up, stops looking like a coin and starts looking like a smudge. That is moisture arriving before it commits to becoming fog. You learn to trust that early softness more than you trust your own optimism, because optimism is a terrible censor, and the ocean exploits it. You step outside for a moment into the lee of the tower where wind is cut down but not gone. The air presses on your cheeks with a certain weight, like damp cloth held close. It is not yet raining, but it smells like rain. That is thinking about it. Salt, ozone, and the faint green rot of seaweed, all stirred together. You look toward the horizon and realize you cannot truly see it. The line between sea and sky is a rumor. That is a practical problem, because the horizon is one of the few stable shapes you normally get. When it disappears, distance becomes harder to hold in your head. So you substitute other anchors. The rhythm of the beam, the interval of the fog signal, if it is running, the quiet certainty of a logbook line written in pencil that says the world was still understandable 5 minutes ago. And when you have done enough watching, you do the most important thing a keeper can do. You go back inside before the weather forces you to. Because the lighthouse is not just a lookout, it is a shelter for attention. Indoors, the air is cooler and drier, and it smells like iron and lamp oil and old wood. You shut the door with a firm pull, feeling the latch bite into place. That sound is small, but it is a kind of victory. Outside is the entire Atlantic or the entire Pacific, depending on where your rock happens to be. Inside is a human-sized world with hinges that obey you. Now the work becomes less about prediction and more about continuity. Small machines do not stay small unless you treat them gently. So you move through the station like a slow inspection lamp, turning your attention into a warm beam. There is salt everywhere, even where it should not be able to reach. A fine film on metal, a faint crust along window frames, a grit on the handrail that makes your palm feel used. Salt is not dramatic. It is patient chemistry with an ocean-sized budget. It rides in on spray, it dries, it pulls water back out of the air, and it keeps metal damp. That dampness becomes corrosion, and corrosion is metal quietly returning to something more stable. You can call it rust, or oxide, or just the slow undoing of your tools. The science is not complicated, just rude. Iron likes oxygen. Add water as a helper, and electrons start moving where you did not invite them. The metal gives itself away, atom by atom, until the smooth surface becomes scabbed and weak. Congratulations, your carefully machined bolt is now a flaky snack for the atmosphere. So you clean, not with anger, but with the calm persistence of someone brushing sand out of a bed. A cloth, slightly oily, a wire brush for stubborn spots, a tin of grease that smells faintly like old machines and older decisions. You wipe down fittings, hinges, and the small exposed parts of the lantern mechanism. The lens itself gets special treatment because glass is honest but not forgiving. A thin smear is enough to steal brightness. not by blocking light like a curtain, but by scattering it the way fog does on a smaller scale. A dirty lens turns your clean beam into an uncertain glow, so you polish with slow circles, careful pressure, and patience. You learn the glass by touch, without ever letting your skin touch it. You can see when it is clean, because reflections get sharper, like the world focusing. If your station is still running a wick lamp, you spend time with the flame's very human needs. Fuel level checked, because the night is long and flames are hungry. Wick trimmed, because char makes smoke, and smoke makes soot, and soot makes your life worse. Airflow adjusted, because fire is picky about oxygen, and it sulks when deprived. A good flame has a shape, a steady teardrop, pale at the base and brighter above. A bad flame flutters and spits, like it resents being employed. If the light is incandescent electric instead, you deal with a different kind of fragility. A filament is a tiny wire doing a very intense job. Current heats it until it glows, bright enough to be useful, hot enough to destroy itself eventually. The bulb is a controlled failure, delayed by vacuum or inert gas, like a deadline you keep extending. You keep spares because the bulb does not care about your schedule. It dies when it dies, and the sea does not accept excuses. Some stations have mantle lamps too in this awkward in-between era. A mantle is a delicate mesh treated with chemicals that glows fiercely when heated by a flame. It feels like cheating because the light is so white, so clean, so much brighter than the simple fire feeding it. But mantles tear and crack and crumble if you breathe wrong near them. They are brilliant and fragile, a familiar combination. You handle them like eggshells with a job interview tomorrow. While you work, the station has its own background music, a faint whir of gears above, a low hum if a generator is running, the occasional knock of a loose shutter, tapping like an impatient finger. You learn which noises are normal and which ones are a new sentence in an old language, a new squeak in the rotation, a new buzz in the radio supply, a new drip where there should not be one. And when you find those changes early, the night stays boring. Boring is the goal. Boring is what safety looks like when it is winning. If you have a generator, you visit it the way you would visit a tired animal in a stall, not with affection exactly, but with respect. It sits in a separate room, partly for noise, partly for fumes, partly because engines are social but not polite. The air in there is warmer, and it carries the scent of fuel and hot oil. Metal sweats heat into the room, and the floor vibrates faintly under your feet. A small internal combustion engine is a controlled sequence of tiny explosions. Air and fuel drawn in, compressed, ignited, forced down, exhausted, over and over like a heartbeat that punches. That motion turns a shaft. The shaft turns an alternator, and the alternator pushes electrons into wires. Those electrons do not care about the romance of the sea. They just move when pushed. And your job is to keep the pushing steady. You check the fuel level because starvation is a common cause of sudden silence. You check the oil because friction is the invisible predator of every moving part. Without oil, bearings grind, heat rises, metal expands, and soon your generator becomes a sculpture. You check airflow because engines need oxygen as much as flames do. If vents are blocked, exhaust lingers, and carbon monoxide builds, quiet and deadly. Carbon monoxide is a gas that looks harmless because you cannot smell it. It binds to hemoglobin in your blood more eagerly than oxygen does. So your red blood cells pick it up like an exciting new hobby, and then they cannot carry what you actually need. You get sleepy, then confused, then you stop being a person with chores. So you keep the room ventilated, and you keep your visits short. Congratulations! You are alive because you respect invisible molecules. If the power comes from batteries instead, you have a different smell to deal with. Lead-acid batteries can release hydrogen gas during charging. Hydrogen is light, quick, and not very impressed by your desire for a quiet night. In the right mixture with air, it becomes explosive. So battery rooms are ventilated too, and sparks are kept away, and terminals are kept clean. Electricity is not a ghost. It is a behavior, and it behaves best when you stop giving it opportunities to misbehave. You tighten terminals with a small wrench, feeling the soft give of metal against metal. Loose connections are trouble because resistance makes heat. Heat makes corrosion faster. Corrosion makes resistance higher. And soon your simple circuit becomes a slow meltdown, like a petty feud that escalates. A lighthouse station is full of feedback loops, some helpful, some not. The helpful ones are the routines you repeat. The unhelpful ones are physics punishing neglect. You work through your list, not fast, not slow, just steady. Wipe down the lantern room rail. Check the vent louvers. Inspect the gasket on the door. Look for water intrusion around the window frames. Salt water is particularly effective at making electricity misbehave because ions make conduction easy. A damp, salty surface becomes a bridge for current, and current loves bridges. So you keep things dry when you can, and you accept that you will never win completely. You are not defeating the sea. You are negotiating with it, one cleaned contact at a time. Now and then you find something slightly wrong, something small enough to fix before it grows teeth. A bolt backed out a fraction, a gear housing that wants fresh grease, a wick that is developing a hard charred ridge. You solve these problems with tiny motions, and you feel the strange satisfaction of preventing future panic. That satisfaction is one of the keeper's quiet rewards. Not excitement, not applause, just the absence of catastrophe. When the maintenance is done, you wash your hands, and the water feels cold and thin. Soap struggles against oil because oil is stubborn and water is loyal to itself. You scrub anyway until your fingers feel clean and slightly dry. Then you glance at the clock because time is the real machinery here. The beam does not care what you are doing. It keeps rotating. The fog signal does not care either if it is on schedule. And the sea keeps arriving at the rock with the same patient force. Now the human part becomes more obvious. You are tired, but the station still expects attention. So, sleep comes in pieces, like a meal eaten during interruptions. You do not lie down for 8 unbroken hours, not if you are alone on station. You lie down for a while, then you get up and check. Then you lie down again, then you listen, then you check. This is not insomnia exactly. It is scheduled vigilance. And the brain changes under scheduled vigilance, the way any organ changes under repeated use. At first, you resent the interruptions. Later, You build your rest around them, like a ship trimming its sails around a steady wind. You learn to fall asleep quickly because you cannot afford long rituals. You learn to wake up without a full argument because waking up is part of the job. And you learn that the mind is a strange animal in isolation. It does not stay empty just because the room is quiet. It fills itself with memories, with imagined conversations, with the replay of small mistakes. Loneliness is not always a dramatic ache. Often it is simply the absence of interruption. No one to contradict you. No one to finish your sentence. No one to notice your mood and ask if it matters. At first, that emptiness can feel like freedom. Then, it can feel like a mirror you cannot turn away from. So, you give the mind something else to do. You give it routines. You give it small observations. You give it the logbook, which is basically a socially acceptable way to talk to yourself. You might make tea, because warm liquid is a kind of emotional technology. A kettle on a small stove, hissing softly, turning water into steam. Steam is just water molecules escaping into air, because heat makes them restless. They bounce harder, break free of the surface, and become invisible motion. It is the same physics that drives weather, only in a pot you can control. You pour the tea and feel heat in your hands, a small domestication of energy. Then you sit in the keeper's room, a plain space with a chair that has learned your shape. There may be a book, but reading is complicated when your eyes keep drifting to the window. Outside, the beam flashes through the glass again, and for a moment, the room is brighter. Then it returns to lamplight and shadow. That pulse becomes your metronome, not loud, not demanding, just present. The brain likes metronomes, even cynical brains. Rhythm gives the nervous system something predictable to hold. And predictability is calming not because it is beautiful, but because it reduces decision. You do not have to decide what happens next. The beam will return, the waves will arrive, the tower will creak. Your job is to remain competent inside that loop. You may find yourself listening for the radio without meaning to, not the content, just the possibility. The imagination treats silence like an open door. If nothing arrives for a while, you start inventing what could arrive: a distress call, a request for bearings, a coastal station asking why your signal is weak. And then, because the mind is unkind, you imagine what happens if you miss it. So you manage your attention the way you manage fuel. You ration it. You do not burn it all at once. You check the receiver at intervals, not constantly. You trust that most nights are uneventful because they usually are. If you want a job that is always exciting, you should choose something with less water involved. When you do lie down, the bed is narrow and the blankets are heavy. Damp air makes fabrics feel heavier than they are, like everything is slightly waterlogged. You can hear the tower even from here. A faint turning sound or a click as a mechanism passes a point. And always the ocean, the steady low shove of surf. You fall asleep with those noises in the background and you wake up inside them. Waking is not an alarm. It is a shift in listening. Your ears catch something different and your brain drags you up to interpret it. Sometimes it is nothing. A gust that changed the pitch of a draft. A wave that hit a rock in a new way. Sometimes it is something, like a new rattle. A sound that suggests a latch is loose. So you get up, put on a sweater, and move through the station again. Your feet know the floor. Your hands know the rail. The building is dark, but not unknown. You climb toward the lantern room and feel the temperature drop as you rise. The glass up there always feels a little colder because it leaks heat into the night. You check the lamp. Steady. You check the lens rotation. Smooth. You check the windows for salt spray buildup because even a thin layer can reduce intensity. Clean enough. For now, you stand for a moment and look out. The sea is almost black, but it is never fully black. There is always some light somewhere, and water reflects it. Starlight, if clouds permit. Moonlight, if you are lucky or unlucky, depending on your preference. And the beam itself, sweeping and returning, turning the world into brief photographs. A ship might appear out there as a cluster of small lights, dim and low. Or it might not appear at all, because distance hides things until they are close. That is one of the cruel truths of open water. You can see far, but you cannot see everything. The curvature of Earth steals what is low to the water. So ships rise into view gradually, mast first, then superstructure, then hull. It is not mystery, it is geometry. A sphere is always hiding something behind itself. You might think early radio solved that, and in some ways it did. But early radio is not constant conversation. It is scheduled and sparse and vulnerable to interference. So the lighthouse still matters. The beam still matters. And the fog signal still matters, because sometimes the only technology available is a human ear and a timed blast. You head back down, because there is no reason to stay in the lantern room once you have confirmed it is alive. A keeper does not worship the light. A keeper maintains it, then leaves it alone to do its work. On the way down, you notice the little domestic details again. A cupboard with mugs, a shelf with spare parts, a coil of rope that smells like wet hemp. These are the artifacts of survival in a place that was never designed for comfort. And in long nights, those small objects start to feel like companions, not because you are losing your mind, though that is always an option, because humans bond with what is consistent. A chair that does not wobble, a kettle that always boils, a pen that always writes. Consistency is a kind of friendship. If you are isolated enough, you might wonder how solitude changes the brain in measurable ways. Not just in poetry. The brain is an organ that predicts. It builds models of the world, then updates them. When input is rich and varied, the model gets constant correction. When input is repetitive, the brain starts generating its own variation. That is why, in isolation, people report hearing voices, or seeing patterns, or feeling watched. It is not necessarily madness. It is a prediction machine doing what it does, filling in gaps. In a lighthouse, the gaps are quiet but persistent. Long stretches with no new human data, no conversation, no faces, no subtle social feedback that tells you who you are today. So you learn to give yourself gentle feedback. You keep the place orderly because disorder feels like mental static. You write logs because words externalize thought. You keep routine because routine is a fence for the mind, and sometimes you talk out loud just to hear a human voice in the room. Your own voice counts. It proves you exist. It also proves you are still capable of speaking like a person and not like a foghorn. Night after night, you become intimately familiar with partial sleep, not the total collapse of consciousness, but the shallow drifting, the naps between checks. The body can adapt to that within limits. Your circadian rhythm, your internal clock, becomes less about sunrise and more about duty. The hormone melatonin rises in darkness, trying to persuade you to sleep. You agree with it in principle, but you do not fully comply. So you get a compromise, a kind of tired calm, a steady low-energy state that keeps you functional. Too much fatigue, though, and your attention becomes sticky. You stare at the same gauge too long. You forget why you entered a room. So you develop little external anchors, because the brain likes rails when it is tired. You keep your tools in the same place, even when it feels obsessive. You put the wrench back on the same nail, because searching costs attention. You fold the same blanket the same way, because it signals closure to your nervous system. You write the same kind of notes in the same part of the logbook, because consistency keeps you honest. When attention slips, you do not argue with it. You treat it like fog, a condition, not a moral failure. You slow down, you touch each step of a task, and you let the routine carry you, because this place punishes improvisation and rewards repetition. The funny part is that your body adapts to this odd life, even if your mood complains. Sleep comes in short cycles, and the brain learns to dive quickly, a kind of trained napping, like an animal that sleeps with one ear open. You get good at waking into competence, not because you want to, but because you must. And when you do wake, you check the world in the same order each time. Light first, because the light is the point. Sound second, because the building tells you the truth through vibration. Then weather, because weather is the only supervisor here. And then, if all is well, you allow yourself small comforts again. In the keeper's room, those comforts are simple and slightly sad, and therefore effective. A mug that fits your hand, a chair with a worn armrest, a book whose pages smell faintly of damp paper and old glue, the rhythm of the beam passing the window, brightening the room briefly, then leaving. You start to notice how the mind changes when the outside world is repetitive. Thoughts arrive in loops, like the lens assembly above you. The same worry returns with the same timing. The same memory shows up, as if it is scheduled. You learn a quiet trick, not a mystical one, just a practical one. When a thought repeats, you label it like you label cloud types. That is just the storm story again. That is the argument I had in 1914. That is the fear of missing a radio call. Naming it reduces its power because it turns it into a category, and categories are easier to carry than raw feelings. The station itself helps because it is always giving you something concrete to notice. A draft along the floorboards, cooler than it was an hour ago. A faint change in the generator hum, like an engine clearing its throat. The smell of kerosene becoming sharper, which means you should check the lamp fittings. Your brain wants to float away, so you give it details to hold. And slowly, you become a person who is good at details. Not because you are gifted, but because your survival depends on it. The coast is not romantic when you are sleepy. It is a checklist with consequences. And speaking of consequences, you keep thinking about the humans out there. The ships that do not want to be brave, they just want to arrive. The men on deck, the hands on ropes, the eyes squinting into darkness. You are not guiding them like a shepherd guides sheep. You are offering a fixed point and letting them do the hard part. That is what a lighthouse really is. It is not a hand on the wheel. It is a sentence that says, "This is where the rock is. Do with that what you will." When a ship is close enough, you can sense it before you see it clearly. A change in sound, the way waves slap differently around a moving hull, a faint engine note carried on wind if the air is right. Sometimes just a cluster of lights that seems too organized to be stars. You go up again because you always go up again. The stairs are familiar, and familiarity is faster than thought. At the lantern room, you look out and see a dark shape sliding through darker water. It is large, but it moves with a slow obedience to physics. Even powered ships still negotiate with drag. They push water aside, and water pushes back, and the argument becomes a wake. You watch that wake catch the beam, a faint white scratch on blackness. If you had to describe the sea in one scientific sentence, it would be this. It is a fluid that does not like to be moved quickly. Water has inertia, like everything else, but it also has viscosity, a reluctance to shear, and that reluctance becomes heat and turbulence and wasted effort. A ship is always paying a tax to move through water. The tax is friction along its hull, and the larger tax of making waves. That wave making is called wave drag, and it is expensive. You can almost see the money burn in the wick behind a steamer. The water rises at the bow, then falls away, then rises again along the sides. Energy is leaving the ship and going into the sea as motion. It looks gentle, but it is work made visible. Sailors learned long ago that wind is free, but it is not cooperative. Wind is just air trying to equalize pressure differences, and it does not care about your schedule. So, sails are clever compromises, ways to steal a little momentum from the sky. Even in the age of early radio, you still see sailing ships sometimes. Their rigging makes a delicate silhouette, like a sketch drawn in darkness. They can move without smoke, without engines, only by managing forces. The wind pushes on the sail, and the sail pushes on the air. That push is not always directly forward, which is the part people forget. A sail is more like an airplane wing than a cloth wall. Air flows around it, faster on one side, slower on the other. Pressure differences appear, and the sail experiences lift, a sideways force. Then the keel and hull resist sideways motion, turning some of that lift into forward progress. Congratulations! You are watching someone tack upwind by politely bullying the atmosphere. When the ship is powered, the physics is less elegant, but more dependable. A propeller is basically a spinning wing pushing water backward. The water pushes the propeller forward in return, because Newton refuses to retire. That thrust must overcome drag, and if it does, the ship accelerates. If it does not, the ship makes noise and stays disappointed. You can sometimes hear propeller cavitation in rough conditions, a harsh rattling growl. Cavitation happens when pressure drops so low behind a spinning blade that water boils locally. Not hot boiling, but pressure boiling. bubbles forming in the low pressure zone. Those bubbles collapse violently when pressure rises again, and they can erode metal. The sea is so efficient that it can weaponize bubbles. Most nights, though, you do not think about cavitation. You think about navigation, the slow, boring art of not dying. A sailor out there has a few anchors of certainty, and you are one of them. They have a compass, a needle that aligns with Earth's magnetic field. It is not pointing to true north, it is pointing to magnetic north, which drifts like a lazy animal. So charts include a correction, a small admission that the planet's field is not a tidy thing. The compass is also moody around metal, which is unfortunate on a ship. Iron and steel distort the field, so compasses are placed carefully and corrected and sometimes argued with. Then there is dead reckoning, the method that sounds grim because it sometimes is. You estimate your position by speed and direction over time. Speed can be guessed from engine settings or measured by a log line in older practice. Direction comes from compass heading, corrected as best as possible. Then, currents interfere because the ocean also has plans. A current is just water moving as a bulk flow, driven by wind, density differences, and the slow spin of Earth. That spin creates the Coriolis effect, which is not a force so much as a consequence of rotating frames. To a sailor, it means large currents curve and spiral rather than moving straight. To you, in a lighthouse, it means drift is always possible. A ship can aim perfectly and still arrive somewhere else if it forgets the water is moving too. So the sailor watches for confirmations, and that is where your light becomes important. The flash pattern says, you are here, near this rock, near this coastline, not near some other one. It reduces the map from a guess to a point. And with early radio, there is another layer of confirmation. Not constant chatter, just occasional check-ins. A ship sends a position report, and a shore station confirms receipt. Sometimes they exchange weather. Sometimes they exchange warnings. Sometimes they exchange nothing at all, because nothing is needed. That is the quiet truth of safe navigation. When it works, it looks like boredom. You can see that boredom from your rock in the steady motion of a ship passing safely offshore. A brief change in light, a shift in bearing, and then it is gone again. No drama, no rescue, no headline. Just a moving machine continuing to move because the world allowed it. You might imagine sailors are always tense, always heroic, wrong in the same way you were wrong about silence. A lot of sailing is waiting, watching, and doing small tasks so problems stay small. A lot of seamanship is maintenance, just like your station. They chip rust, they grease fittings, they check lines, they log weather. They listen to engines for changes in tone, the way you listen to gears in the lantern room. They are not fighting the sea in a cinematic sense. They are cooperating with physics and avoiding the moments when physics stops cooperating. From your perspective, the lighthouse does not guide them like a path. It confirms their mental model. It tells them their compass and reckoning are not lying too badly tonight. It says the coastline is where it should be, which is the best news the sea ever gives. In the age of early radio, some ships experiment with radio direction finding. Not every vessel has it, not every station supports it. But the idea is simple. If you can measure the direction a radio signal is coming from, you can get a line of bearing. With 2 bearings from different stations, you can triangulate a position. In practice, early direction finding is fiddly. Antennas are rotated, signals fade, atmospherics hiss, and the ionosphere plays tricks. But when it works, it is another anchor. Another way of saying, you are not lost, just tired. You, as a keeper, may not perform direction finding yourself, but you are part of the network. You are a known transmitter, a known location, a fixed point that can be used. That is an odd feeling, being a coordinate in someone else's survival. It makes your loneliness feel more purposeful, though still lonely. And while all this navigation is happening, your own work returns to the simplest truth. The light must stay on, and the signals must stay consistent. Everything else is commentary, which is why you care so much about the gentle laws behind it all. Light travels in straight lines in uniform air until something interrupts it. That is why a clean lens matters, because it shapes those lines. You can think of the Fresnel lens as a disciplined crowd manager, bending rays into order. Refraction is the mechanism, light slowing in glass and changing direction. The amount it bends depends on the refractive index, a measure of how much a material slows light compared to vacuum. You do not say refractive index out loud to sailors because they have work to do, but you feel it in your hands when you polish the glass. That glass is not just transparent. It is a carefully chosen material with predictable behavior. The Fresnel design is also an engineering compromise. It reduces weight, which matters when the lens must rotate smoothly. It reduces absorption, because thick glass can swallow light, turning it into heat. It makes manufacturing possible because making a giant, thick, perfect lens is expensive and fragile. Instead, you make rings and prisms and assemble them into a bright machine. The lens does not create light, it only directs it. That distinction matters because it shows where the true cost is. The cost is fuel and maintenance and human attention. The lens is the part that saves you from wasting that cost. And then there is the air itself, the medium that carries your beam to the horizon. Air is mostly nitrogen and oxygen, with argon and other trace gases. Water vapor comes and goes, changing density and refractive properties slightly. Most nights, those changes are small enough to ignore, but sometimes the air layers become visible in effect, bending light subtly. Mirages at sea can occur when temperature gradients bend light paths. A ship might appear lifted or stretched or oddly distorted near the horizon. It is not ghosts. It is refraction in a layered atmosphere. The same basic principle as the lens, but scaled up to the sky. You watch it sometimes, a distant light that seems to hover. You do not get excited because you have learned that nature loves optical pranks. You just note it and you keep the beam turning. Sound, too, follows dependable rules, even when weather makes it weird. A foghorn creates pressure waves, compressions, and rarefactions moving through air. The speed depends on temperature, mostly, with humidity as a smaller modifier. Warm air carries sound faster than cold air. Wind can carry sound downwind and create a shadow upwind, making a horn audible in one direction and absent in another. Temperature inversions can duct sound, bending it toward the ground and letting it travel farther. Again, The sky behaves like a lens, but for vibration instead of light. Radio is the third member of this signal family, and it is the strangest. It is not a pressure wave in air. It is not photons visible to eyes. It is electromagnetic radiation at longer wavelengths, oscillating electric and magnetic fields moving together. The antenna does not throw particles. It sets up oscillations that propagate outward. At the receiver, another antenna experiences those oscillations as tiny induced currents. Then circuits amplify, detect, and translate them into clicks in your headphones. It feels like hearing through walls, because, in a way, you are. You are hearing through the curvature of Earth, through night air, through interference. In early radio, much of it is amplitude modulation, where the strength of a carrier wave is varied to encode information. In Morse code transmission, it is simpler. You turn the carrier on and off. On, off, long, short, with spacing that turns into letters. The receiver is a translator between invisible waves and audible pattern. Early detectors are often crystal sets, using minerals like galena to rectify radio frequency currents, a tiny junction that lets current flow more easily one way than the other. It is a primitive diode before the term becomes common. That little asymmetry allows the circuit to extract the envelope of the signal, turning high-frequency oscillations into slower changes your ears can follow. It is delicate, finicky, and strangely beautiful, a rock that helps you hear a ship. Later, vacuum tubes improve sensitivity, amplifying signals with heated cathodes and controlled electron flow. A triode tube is basically a valve for electrons. Heat knocks electrons free from a metal surface, a process called thermionic emission. A grid controls their flow to an anode, letting small voltages modulate larger currents. It is a fragile little furnace in a glass bulb, and it hums quietly with purpose. But vacuum tubes also hate vibration, and they hate moisture, and they hate salty air, like everything else here. So you treat them gently, like nervous birds. All of these signals, light, sound, radio, rely on calm laws that do not get tired. That is the comforting part, the part you cling to when your own brain is foggy. The laws are steady even when you are not. Refraction does not forget why it bends light. Induction does not lose interest in magnetic fields. Combustion does not take a night off. It just demands oxygen and fuel. If something fails, it is not because physics changed. It is because maintenance did not happen, or a part wore out, or weather exceeded design. That is almost reassuring, because it means the world is not personal. It is only strict, and strict systems can be managed with routine. Speaking of routine, you return to the radio desk at intervals because ships do not announce themselves politely ahead of time. You listen again, headphones snug, pencil ready. The static is familiar now, like the sound of wind in a chimney. You tune slowly, and a station comes into focus. A call sign tapped cleanly. Then a short message requesting a weather update. You answer with what you know. Wind shifting west, barometer steady, visibility moderate. You do not embellish. You do not poetically describe the sea. You provide data because data reduces bad decisions. After the exchange, the silence returns. You sit with it for a moment longer than necessary because it is oddly soothing. The hiss is constant and constant things calm the nervous system. Then you stand, and you put the headphones down carefully, because breaking them would be a stupid way to create excitement. You check the lamp again, because the lamp is always the point. And while you move through these tasks, you notice something about your own mind. It is beginning to accept the loop. Not enjoy it exactly, but accept it. The beam swings, the horn waits, the radio crackles, the logbook fills. You sleep a little, you remain competent. It is not a grand life, but it is a stable one. Stability is a rare commodity on water. So humans build it where they can. In towers, in routines, in repeating signals. Outside, the ship you noticed earlier is farther now. Its lights smaller, its wake erased. A passage completed without incident, which is the best kind of passage. Another vessel may appear later, or not. Either way, your work is the same. And that sameness gives you time to think about how fragile the whole system is, and how surprisingly resilient it can be. A lighthouse is not a fortress, it is a set of vulnerabilities managed carefully. Glass that can crack, fuel that can leak, gears that can seize, wires that can corrode, a human body that needs sleep and warmth and oxygen. If any one of these fails at the wrong time, consequences multiply. So you do not trust luck. You trust inspection. You trust redundancy. Where you have it, spare bulbs, spare wicks, backup lanterns. You trust that your future self will be grateful you wrote that one line in the log. And you trust that most nights, the ocean will accept your offering of predictability and move along. There is a strange philosophical comfort in being a small part of a large, uncaring system. That comfort comes from knowing the rules are older than you, and they do not improvise. Your little world here is gears and glass and fuel, and it behaves if you do. So you keep living like a metronome, with boots on, a check, a note, a wipe, a listen, and after enough nights, you stop thinking of it as work. You start thinking of it as load management for reality, because reality out here is heavy, and you move it one small lever at a time. Speaking of levers, you end up loving the simplest machines most. A latch that closes cleanly, a hinge that swings without complaint, a valve that turns smoothly instead of fighting you. These are not poetic objects, but they are honest. They tell you immediately if they are healthy. A good hinge feels like it is floating on its own axis. A bad hinge feels gritty, like it swallowed sand and regrets it. So you keep a little oil can nearby, like a physician making house calls. Not too much oil, because too much oil becomes a dirt magnet. Just enough to make friction stop chewing on your hardware. Friction is the silent expense that shows up everywhere. Two surfaces rubbing, microscopic bumps, grabbing, tearing, and heating. The metal does not look like mountains to you, but at the scale of atoms, it is jagged enough to fight. So, lubrication is a peace treaty. A thin film that keeps solids from touching directly. It turns grinding into sliding, and sliding into something almost gentle. You feel the difference when you turn a handle after oiling it. The resistance drops, and your hand relaxes without permission. Your body likes when the world behaves. It is not philosophical. It is neurological. Less resistance means fewer alarm signals in your nervous system. That is why maintenance feels calming, even when it is endless. You are literally reducing the number of small struggles per hour. Salt tries to undo that constantly. It settles in the corners and it attracts moisture from the air. That moisture becomes an electrolyte, a fancy word for a liquid that helps charges move. Once charges can move, corrosion becomes easy. So you develop a habit of wiping exposed metal like it is a ritual. Brass fittings, steel fasteners, the little screws that hold your world together, you wipe them down and you leave behind a thin protective film. Not a force field, just a delay, a way of telling chemistry politely to come back later. Some nights, you deal with the rotating light machinery itself. If it is weight-driven, you wind it like a clock. The crank has a steady feel, and you can sense the weight rising by resistance. You are storing potential energy in lifted mass. Gravity will spend that energy slowly, turning it into rotation, and the rotation will turn into flashes on the horizon. It is a chain of conversions, each one simple. Lift a weight, turn a gear train, spin a lens, send photons outward, make a sailor adjust course by a few degrees, and never mention it again. If it is motor-driven, you listen differently. Motors have a hum that tells you their mood. A clean hum means steady load and healthy bearings. A rougher note can mean misalignment, or a dry bearing, or a brush wearing down. You do not need to be an electrical engineer to notice trouble. Your ears are older than engineering degrees. They know when a sound is strained. The lantern room itself rewards attention with immediate feedback. When everything is right, the beam looks crisp, even through sea haze. When something is off, the beam looks tired. It still works, but it lacks confidence. Sometimes it is as small as salt film on the glass. Sometimes it is a lamp not burning quite cleanly, depositing a thin soot veil. Soot is carbon that did not fully oxidize. It is the mark of incomplete combustion, like a sentence that never finishes. Fire wants enough oxygen and proper mixing. If you starve it, it makes smoke. If you feed it right, it burns cleaner, hotter, brighter. So you adjust air vents and wick height with a steady hand. You are tuning a chemical reaction that happens to be useful. On the radio side, the maintenance is quieter but just as picky. Contacts oxidize, especially in coastal air. Oxide layers can act like tiny insulators, raising resistance. That makes signals weaker and makes heating more likely at bad joints. So you clean the contacts, sometimes with fine abrasive, sometimes with alcohol. You tighten screws because vibration loosens everything eventually. The tower vibrates in wind, the generator vibrates when running. Even waves transmit vibration through stone. Everything here is gently shaking all the time. That is the ocean's way of reminding you nothing is truly still. And then there are the batteries, if your station uses them for backup. Lead-acid batteries are both simple and moody. They store energy as chemical potential using lead plates and sulfuric acid. During discharge, reactions shift and electrons flow through your circuits. During charging, you push the reactions backward with electricity, forcing the chemistry to reset. If you overcharge, you make more hydrogen and oxygen gas. If you undercharge, you let sulfate crystals harden on the plates, reducing capacity. So you treat batteries like sleep itself. Not too little, not too much, and never ignored for long. Even your tools have to be maintained. Wrenches wiped dry, so they do not rust, lanterns checked for leaks, spare parts kept in tins because damp air eats paper labels. A lighthouse keeper is partly a curator of objects. You keep a museum of useful things, all of them vulnerable, and you keep it alive by being annoyingly consistent. Somewhere in the middle of this, you realize the station is also a thermal system. Heat leaves through glass and stone and drafty seams. Heat enters from lamps, engines, and your own body. You can feel the gradients in different rooms. The lantern room is cold because wind strips heat away. The generator room is warm because combustion is basically heat delivery with extra steps. The living room is somewhere between, warmed by a stove if you have one. You learn to move through these zones like a lizard, seeking comfort efficiently. If you are cold, you do not just suffer artistically. You close vents in the right places, you light the stove, you drink something hot. Cold makes fingers clumsy, and clumsy fingers make mistakes. So warmth is a safety tool, not a luxury. But there is always one more quiet enemy you respect at night: condensation. Warm, moist air meets a cold surface, and water appears. It looks like the wall is sweating, because it is. That water is pure trouble in a mechanical and electrical world. It encourages rust, it swells wood, it invites mold. On radio equipment, it can change capacitance and cause leakage paths. So you ventilate when you can, and you heat when you must. You balance the inside air like you balance a flame. Not perfect, just stable. The logbook becomes your witness through all of this. You write what you did, what you saw, and what you suspect. Not because you love writing, because fatigue makes liars of memory. A log is a prosthetic memory, a paper brain that does not sleep. On some nights, the routine is so smooth, it feels like the station is running itself. That is when you catch yourself thinking too broadly. You start considering the humans who built the system and why. Not in a grand, patriotic way, but in a practical one. Shipping lanes exist because people want goods, and goods want boats. Boats want safe coastlines, and coastlines do not want to cooperate. So you get lighthouses and charts and radio procedures. It is not romance, it is infrastructure. And infrastructure is society admitting it cannot rely on luck. Out there, a ship is a moving compromise. It wants to go straight, but currents pull it sideways. It wants to go fast, but drag charges interest. It wants to trust the sky, but weather lies. So it uses your flash pattern, your horn schedule, and sometimes your radio call sign. All of them are ways of saying, this is still the world you think it is. And yes, the laws of nature are calm, but humans are not. Which is why you end up paying attention to the human side of navigation too. Not the heroic myths, the small procedures. A captain keeping a steady watch rotation. A mate checking bearings on a compass repeater. A radio operator listening to static for a ship that might never call. The most important safety systems are usually boring people doing boring things reliably. That is the real miracle, if you insist on having one. Some nights you hear a ship call for a radio check. It is not an emergency, just a test. You answer with your call sign and the time. That simple exchange is a calibration of reality. Their transmitter works, your receiver works, the ionosphere is cooperating. A whole invisible chain just proved itself, briefly, and then it goes back to silence. Silence, as you have learned, is not empty. It is only the absence of messages meant for you. Even then, you can sometimes hear distant stations bleeding in, a faint code pattern under your own noise floor. Radio waves do not respect borders, and they do not care who paid for the antenna. They spread, reflect, refract, fade, and return. In the age you are visiting, frequency allocations are less disciplined, so the spectrum can feel crowded, like a room full of people whispering. You learn to pick out the voice you need. A ship nearby will be stronger, lower hiss, sharper keying. A far station will sound thinner, fluttering with fading. Fading is the radio version of waves interfering. Signals take multiple paths, some direct, some bounced off the sky. They arrive with slightly different timing, adding and subtracting, so the strength rises and falls like breathing. You sit with that slow pulse in your headphones, and it almost matches the beam outside. Different physics, same rhythm. Speaking of rhythm, the most delicate rhythm in your whole system is actually human sleep. You can maintain a lamp and you can grease bearings, but you cannot easily maintain a brain that is missing rest. So you become careful with your own resources. You learn what kind of tired you are. There is the good tired, the one that makes you calm and steady. And there is the bad tired, the one that makes you forget steps and skip checks. The difference matters more than pride. In the early radio era, some stations have more than one keeper. A principal keeper, assistants, rotating duties. In others, you are alone more often than you would like. Either way, night work breaks sleep into segments. You nap, wake, check, nap again. This is called polyphasic sleep now, like it is a lifestyle choice. Here, it is just survival in a place that does not pause. Your brain does a strange thing with segmented sleep. It learns to drop quickly into deeper stages when it can. Not always, but often enough to keep you functional. You might dream fast, intense, like the mind is cashing out quickly. Then you wake with the beam still sweeping, and the dream leaves like fog. Even your perception of time changes. Hours are not measured by clocks as much as by tasks. Winding the weight, checking the lamp, listening to the receiver, writing the log. Time becomes a loop of responsibilities, and the clock is just a label. You notice loneliness in small ways. A joke you think of and nobody to waste it on. A worry that would shrink if spoken, but grows because it stays inside. So you develop methods that are quietly scientific. You externalize thoughts into writing. You build routines that reduce decision fatigue. You keep objects in consistent places to reduce searching. Your environment becomes an extension of your cognition. A lighthouse is not only a signal station. It is a scaffold for a mind trying to stay sharp in the dark. If you have ever tried to stay awake in a quiet room, you know the brain's tricks. It starts making patterns out of noise. It starts turning ordinary creaks into footsteps. It starts suggesting you saw movement at the edge of vision. That is not the station being haunted. That is your visual system being bored and overprotective. In low light, your eyes rely more on rod cells, which are sensitive but not detailed. They detect motion well, but they smear shape and color. So shadows look alive, and your brain fills the gaps with guesses. This is why the beam's periodic flash can feel strange indoors. Every sweep changes the shadows abruptly. A chair leg becomes a long claw, then becomes a chair leg again. Your nervous system notices the change. and asks questions. You answer the questions with familiarity. Just the beam again. Just the lens doing its endless turn. Your hearing plays similar games. At night, with fewer competing sounds, you hear deeper into the noise. You notice distant breakers, and you notice the tower's small settling sounds. Sometimes you swear you heard a faint tap that is not real. It is real in the sense that your brain created it. Auditory perception is prediction plus input. When input is thin, prediction gets louder. So you give yourself stable input, a kettle boiling, a page turning, a radio hiss, small sounds that are honest and controllable. You might even prefer the generator running, despite the noise. A steady engine hum is a kind of acoustic nightlight. It masks the tiny ambiguous creaks that invite imagination. It is hard to be spooked when an engine is doing practical work nearby. The station becomes, in this way, a machine that regulates your mood, not intentionally, but effectively. Your routines produce a predictable sensory environment. Predictable sensations reduce vigilance. Reduced vigilance allows rest, even if it is partial. And partial rest is what keeps you competent enough to prevent disasters. So you stop judging yourself for not sleeping like a person in a safe inland house. You sleep like a keeper. In pieces, but with purpose. And then, when you wake for another check, you return to the reason the tower exists. The sea lanes, the moving dots of ships, the slow trade of cargo and people through darkness. You climb again, because climbing is part of your identity now. The stairs feel cool under your hand. The metal rail is colder than the air, because metal gives up heat quickly. In the lantern room, you do the same scan. Lamp steady, lens turning, no strange soot pattern, no new vibration. And then you look outward and you see a ship farther off than before. Just lights, low and patient. It is not close enough to need you urgently, but it is close enough that your light will be part of its night. You remember that navigation without drama is mostly confirmation. A sailor takes a compass course, estimates speed, and checks against landmarks. But at sea, landmarks are rare. So a lighthouse becomes a mathematical anchor, a fixed coordinate. A flash pattern tells them which light it is. The bearing tells them their line of position. Distance can be estimated by brightness in clear air, but that is unreliable. More reliable is timing and charted range, and the simple fact of not wanting to be near rocks. They keep a safe offing, a comfortable distance from shore. Your job is to make sure your signal remains consistent so their charts remain true. That consistency is a kind of contract. You provide predictable flashes. They provide predictable caution. And the ocean provides predictable indifference. Sometimes you think about the geometry of visibility again. How the Earth's curve hides the low parts of ships. The distance to the horizon depends on height. From a lighthouse lantern room, you see farther because you are higher. From a ship's deck, they see less. So the light's height matters almost as much as its brightness. Not because taller is noble, but because higher delays the curve's theft. This is why lighthouse towers are tall even when the rock is already high. Engineers stack height on height because geometry is stubborn. They want the beam to clear waves and haze and the curvature itself. Even then, the atmosphere meddles. On nights with strong temperature layers, light can bend slightly. Sometimes it bends downward. extending range a little. Sometimes it bends upward, reducing it. This can create strange effects. Lights visible when they should not be, or absent when they should. Sailors learn not to bet their lives on perfect optics. They use multiple cues, compass, soundings when near shore, measuring depth with lead line in older practice, time and speed estimates, and, in your era, occasional radio. It is redundancy layered on redundancy, because the ocean will happily exploit single points of failure. You notice how similar this is to your own station design. Backup lamp, spare wick, extra fuel, spare tube for the receiver. Redundancy is not pessimism. It is realism with a pencil. A ship's officer might take bearings on 2 lights to confirm position, 2 lines crossing on a chart, a simple X marking current reality. That X is comfort. It is the opposite of being unmoored. Your light is one of those lines. The other might be another lighthouse, or a headland, or a star if skies are clear. Celestial navigation still exists in this era too. Sextants, chronometers, and math, using the sky as a reference grid. It is beautiful, but it is also work, and clouds ruin it quickly. So your artificial star on a rock remains valuable. Even when radio can carry messages, it cannot always carry certainty. Not yet. Radio direction finding is still finicky. Time signals help ships set chronometers, but those signals can be missed, and voice radio is not widespread and clear yet, so the lighthouse remains the low-tech backbone, a visible truth in a world of partial information. On certain nights, you might hear more than routine. A ship requesting a medical advisory, a report of debris, a warning about fog bank movement. Still calm messages, but you can feel the thin edge of risk under them. You answer as best you can, and you log everything. Then you go back to being boring, because boring is what you control. The scientific comfort here is that all these signals are just energy in different costumes. Light is electromagnetic energy at short wavelengths, interacting with glass through refraction. Sound is mechanical energy in air, interacting with temperature and wind through changes in speed. Radio is electromagnetic energy at long wavelengths, interacting with